tell you a little bit about how we are planning this event. So basically, what we will do is our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes or so, like 8 to 10 minutes, just to give a general overview of their work, both specialized in climate change disaster, but also politics. So hopefully there will be some intersecting issues, but also different sort of issues to kind of talk about. Then I will, as a roundtable, I'll ask them some questions, like 3 or 4 questions, just based on their work, but also maybe based on the presentation itself. So I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open up for question and answer. So that's the sort of a general structure of the program. Now, without further ado, maybe let me introduce you to the speakers for today. Our first speaker, Dr. Ayesha Siddiqi, welcome Ayesha, is an assistant professor in human geography at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Siddiqi's research uses hazard-based disasters, floods, typhoons, and landslides, basically all sort of hazards, to interrogate political relations and power dynamics on the margin of the post-colonial state. She also has a book. Actually, I have a book with me right now, after the disaster, and it was really, really inspiring, particularly for my PhD research. It came a bit late, like 2019, when I was just finishing, but I really use it, and I also use it for my teaching. So that's really, Ayesha, again, before she was in Cambridge, she was based at the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. She has an interdisciplinary background and has done considerable work on the interface of academia, policy, and most recently for the UK's House of Parliament, right? That's Ayesha Siddiqi. Our second speaker, Mr. Navin Singh Khadka, is a senior environmental correspondent for the BBC who specializes in climate change-related reporting. He has worked as a journalist, global multilingual environmental journalist for over 30 years. And I was just telling you, so we both come from Nepal, so we have that connection too, but I'm meeting him for the first time. I grew up actually reading his reporting for Kathmandu Post and all sort of English media newspaper in Nepal. And we've also collaborated, myself, Gareth, who is here on another topic. And it's a real pleasure to meet you for the first time. So we're really looking forward to your talk. And he's basically covered a wide range of issues from basically COP is another, which is again really interesting to hear a little bit about it because it's happening next week, COP 28. He's also reported about the recent floods or infrastructure disaster in northwest India, in Sikkim. Science behind the Fukushima water waste, another very interesting topic, and also mostly focus on the Himalayan region. So that's something that he'll be talking about hopefully today. So that's our 2 speakers. So for the next phase of our roundtable, I would like to request Ayesha to maybe go first and share a little bit about your research.
Sure.
Thank you.
Do I need to do anything to the mic or is it fine? Yeah, it's okay. All right. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you all for being here and for being interested in the conversation for today. So I wasn't quite sure what I was doing, if I was going to be pitching this to an academic audience or a more kind of practitioner audience or a student audience. So I've just pieced together bits and pieces of my research that you may or may not find interesting. So let's hope this kind of works. I don't think I need to say too much because Nimesh's introduction was really quite comprehensive, but just to give you a little bit of background, my research is from the perspective of and the examples I gave and the way that I talk about disasters is from the perspective of somebody who increasingly identifies as a post-colonial geographer and who originally started with the study of disasters, but felt like there was more that I wanted to contribute and say to the discipline of geography, to an understanding of hazard risk, to bigger questions around space and spatiality and those kinds of things. And very kind of concretely, I've worked on 3 or 4 different projects, and each of these countries represents one of the projects where I've worked. The methods that I use in my research are very much kind of ethnographic and arts-based. So this means that I've spent more time kind of doing qualitative interviewing and things like arts-based workshops where people come in and draw and paint some of the ways in which they've experienced the disaster. So that's from one of the most recent workshops we did in Peru, where we were asking people to tell us a little bit about what caused their house to be flooded. And actually, the thing that almost everyone talked about were the broken dikes and not the rainfall. So just to give you a sense of the way that that I've spent time trying to understand these issues is from these kinds of more humanities-based perspectives. And what I'm trying to do now really is, through my work, try and make a post-colonial intervention, by which I mean really from the perspective of people living and experiencing these disasters in their everyday life, to the bigger understanding of a critical geographies of disaster, or a critical understanding of disaster in geography. Because for a long time, there have been fairly kind of established frameworks around hazard that have either been driven by hazards or been driven by vulnerability, or been driven by people trying to say something a little bit different. But in many of these perspectives, the voice of the post-colonial subject, the person living on the margins, the person experiencing these disasters, is often missing. So what I'm trying to do now, and this is a little bit of where my the direction in which my research is headed. So I'm going to just make 4 kind of broad points that have emerged from my research. And the first is that disasters have repeatedly shown us that there is a particular kind of material coloniality, and there is an epistemic or a coloniality of knowledge hierarchies. And those two are intimately linked in producing the disaster. And to make this very abstract concept kind of concrete, in the most recent floods in Pakistan, perhaps some of you might remember that last year in 2022, I heard for maybe the 3rd or the 4th time in my life that Pakistan has experienced the worst flooding it's ever experienced, right? And yet every time it's considered the worst, by which I really just mean to emphasize that Pakistan repeatedly experiences floods of fairly catastrophic proportions along the Indus Delta. And we know what time they will come. We know which region they will affect the most. We know a lot about them. And yet we keep experiencing these floods every year. So it's really important to understand that these floods in some ways are a political choice. They are a choice of a particular kind of imperial or colonial understanding of science and engineering, and only these kinds of hard interventions can solve Pakistan's flooding related problems. I call that a particular way of thinking, the epistemic coloniality. And the material coloniality is that actually there are in fact large infrastructures, barrages all along the southern part of the country, dams all along the northern parts that repeatedly and regularly have infrastructure failures, and levees that break, which result in, so both the materiality of the colonial architecture, some of which was left behind by the British, some of which has very kind of actively been taken forward by the post-colonial state, that kind of infrastructure, that material coloniality intersects with this colonial coloniality in the mind, the epistemic coloniality of engineering and science and hard solutions will solve our problems. And together, they repeatedly produce these floods in Pakistan. So what I'm trying to challenge now to some extent is that for a long time, geography has been really fixated on knowledge related and epistemic related coloniality, but we really need to start to think more about the political economy of this coloniality. Why is it that these particular infrastructures and barrages and material forms of disaster risk production really are not being challenged or contested? And I want to kind of integrate or marry these two understandings. The second thing that I want to kind of leave you with, or idea, is that temporality, or what time period you look at, is extremely powerful in reproducing or in challenging the hegemony of Western science. So for so long, all of us, when we think about where we were when a particular disaster took place, a particular hazard, a particular earthquake, a particular whatever, it's that the particular landslide, it's that the landslide started at 4:24 a.m. or 3:25 p.m. But if you do that, then the only thing that matters is what the climatology is telling you, right? Then it's all about the science of how that event happened or took place or whatever. Whereas in my research, what I've repeatedly seen is it's a much longer picture. The reason there were floods in the north coast of Peru, where I was recently doing research, was because of something that started, a program of kind of building these dikes and embankments that started in 1871. And that's why, and subsequently how every decision that was made these defenses better, then made them weaker, then invested in some defenses, then took away money from other defenses. So it was a really long-term construction of a hazard, which resulted in this was the particular field site we were in, that the people who lived closest to where that red dot is, where the dike was broken, were the people who were affected singularly the most. The biggest factor compared to any other factors was how close your house was to the dike, right? And to understand why, you have to look at a much longer history. So actually, the continuous reliance on a particular climate model or climate meteorological model, etc., becomes really problematic. You have to look at a much longer kind of historical picture. And obviously, as a post-colonial scholar, I'm really interested in understanding indigenous knowledges and how people understand this in their own kind of material being, in their own stories, in their own narratives, in their own knowledge systems. And I'm repeatedly asked kind of, can you tell us about one of these knowledge systems? And the thing is, indigenous knowledges are not one thing. There is no one thing like geology that you can then equate to, this is indigenous geological knowledge. It's not, it doesn't work that way, right? In some contexts, in the context of Pakistan, where I did some field research, there was a lot of indigenous knowledge around particular cosmological visions, particular belief systems, etc., that were linked to the river. In the Philippines, there was a lot of knowledge on architectural material things that are more resilient to typhoons than others. And in Peru, there was a lot of kind of lived experience of which sandbags need to be placed in which, very much more kind of practical, hands-on, right? So each of these contributes something in very different ways, but they are not one thing. They cannot all be clumped as geological indigenous knowledge or social indigenous knowledge. We have to be really kind of plural and diverse in the way that we consider these knowledges. And finally, the last thing that I'm going to leave you with is that when you begin to challenge the way that disasters have been constructed, understood, produced, etc., for long periods of time, right? Like even the vulnerability school, of which I'm sure you must teach about in your courses, has been around since the 1970s, right? So when you're really kind of trying to deconstruct the power of how these terms are defined, how these issues are understood, you're really challenging power and power systems and power structures. So this is going to sound like someone who's a little bit jilted, and perhaps I am. But really, what I'm going to show you is reviewer feedback I got from a grant that wasn't accepted, and those are the words of the reviewer. They said that if I tried too much to bring all of these subaltern knowledges and experience into the debate on disaster studies within geography, that it really wouldn't be of any use to the Western Academy, right? So I'm just trying to say that when you begin to start challenging power and power systems, you do get a lot of pushback, and it is much harder to do. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. So those are the 4 messages. Sorry, I've probably gone over 10 minutes, so I was looking at my phone a lot to try and stay within time, but thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Well, as you can see, I come from a very different background, and forgive me if I do not talk or use your lingos. We, come to the point. It's mass media. People need to understand. Even when I'm writing this, my editor is saying, "Oh, go away. I don't want the story." People they are not interested. They will not understand this and that. So I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. So basically, you see, the whole thing is, I was told that disasters, risks, and politics, lumped together. I mean, I would like to start with this, if you have not seen this already. So the risk thing, you see, I mean, this is the thing. If you looked at this list, say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, then you would see other things on the top. But now, if you look at this risk thing, every year it comes out, then you'll see natural disasters, climate change, biodiversity, topping the list increasingly. So that is, we live with that reality. I mean, at least globally, that has been accepted. We can talk about it, but this is by and large accepted. And then the IPCC, I'm sure you know, that is the UN, topmost body, brings out this report every 6 to 7 years. So the last one said that, we've, in some cases, in some places, we have reached the limits to adapt to those changes. Now, to me, this is quite worrying. And then if you are familiar with what WMO, IPCC, what they've been talking about, 1.5, as you know, 1.5 is the magic figure. The question here is, can we limit the average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees? Today, as we talk, it's 1.1, or we also say 1.2 compared to pre-industrial period. And already we are seeing this. So, but still scientists are saying if it is 1.5, if we could limit to that, then, we could save ourselves. But WMO has warned, IPCC has warned that it's like almost mission impossible now. And there will be an overshoot. Now, the question here is, again, to me, during that overshoot, even that's temporary, according to IPCC, there will be some irreversible impacts. There will be some irreversible impacts. That's the key word for me. Now, the question is, where is that going to happen? That's the key thing. See, I mean, if you look at the map now, I think the intelligence, or let's say, the secret agencies or security apparatuses of countries, I think, they are trying to look now, where are those places that are really going to be hit, and comparatively, there are safer places. That information, that intelligence. And then just yesterday, or was it day before yesterday, UNEP has brought this report out. I'm sure you've seen it. Again, the magic figure, if you want to limit to 1.5, you need to reduce your emission by 42%. If it is too still, then you'll have to bring it down by 28%. But where are we? Look at that second one. Even if we really live up to all our commitments, very, very honestly, it's hardly between 2 and 9%, grossly inadequate. That shows where are we heading towards 2.5, 2.9, 2.5, 2.9, i.e. 3 degrees. All right. Again, I repeat, imagine 1.1. This is the state now already. Imagine 3, okay? And then in most optimistic scenario, UNEP said 14% is the only chance we have. And then, this is also another worrying thing. So, the net zero thing, as we are all told that net zero will save us. So many countries have come up with net zero announcements. But here is UNEP again, just day before yesterday said it's not credible because those very countries are showing 1.2% increase rather. And none of their policies is consistent to net zero policy. It's UNEP saying, and this finding is going to be a major feed into COP28, which is kicking off next week. Because, as you know, this COP is going to be the first ever global stock taking ever since we signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. Where are countries in regards to those pledges, what they did in Paris? And then again, this was interesting. I don't know if you saw, it was just today, Fatih Birol, he's the head of the IEA, the International Energy Agency. What he said, he gives this very interesting figure. So all this oil and gas industries, they are just, investing, if you look at the investment into clean energy, oil and gas industries are just 1% of that investment. That's very worrying because, they keep on saying that, we'll move on to new things. But his finding is just 1%. This is very, very worrying. And then, of course, look at this figure. He keeps on saying that, if you are really to transition, for each dollar we spend on fossil fuels, it should be matched, by 8. But now, if you look at the figure, it's just getting $1.5. So that mismatch is there. And then again, like last year I did this story during Egypt. They went to talk about climate change there, but then look what they did. They were actually dealing, they were signing off gas deals. So many European and American companies were signing deals with African countries, African governments or companies. And then therefore, there's this fear that, we'll be locking ourselves with gas now, particularly after the pandemic, and then more so after Russia-Ukraine war. So, and then, the US Willow project, for example, what happened in Germany, this country has given, extraction licenses, hundreds of them. So all these are like, wow, where are we? Going back, what the science is saying and what we are doing. And then, not to forget this one. So, the oil boss is heading the COP20 thing, which is very, very controversial. UAE, it has a big ambition to expand its oil deals. So the politics here is, how will other countries, fast emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, how will they react to, when they see Western countries doing all that? That's the question. That's the politics. So we talked about disasters, we talked about risks, and this is the politics, you see. So Western countries are, going to the opposite direction. UNEP's report just yesterday, day for yesterday, exposed that G20's, net zero is a fiasco up until now. And then, so now look what China is doing, what India is doing. And then what happens is, the talk about carbon capture storage, largely unproven. We don't know. So that G20 meeting in Delhi recently, so there was this give and take. So Western countries would say, don't talk about our gas and oil, and we'll not talk about your coal. That's the deal. That's the politics between fast emerging economies like China, India, and Western countries. That's the thing. That's the politics. So that brings us, here, the question that I said. If 1.1 is already doing this, what will happen if we reach 2 or 3? Okay, surprises. Because even scientists are now flummoxed, what's happening. Look at, they're talking about, that it's not just flash floods now, it's flash droughts. Droughts, usually in the past, used to take years and decades. Now, droughts within months, and they're calling it flash droughts. Surprises like that. What's happening to oceans? Look at these the circulations. It's not just about projection anymore. It's about what's happening right now. So the question is, are we already in that tipping point? How are we doing time-wise? Yeah, okay. And then look at this one I did quite recently, rains reaching where it only snowed before. All around the world, these mountains, what I found was there were altitudes where it only used to snow. But now there are places where now, it snows less, rains more. And the striking example in this story, if you read, was Everest Base Camp. just this season, Everest Base Camp recorded record amount of rainfall. So that kind of thing, surprises. So natural disasters, that definitely in the wake of all this, it's gonna go up. Look at that figure, 18 billion a year, World Bank said. And then, all this insurance people are coming up with all these kind of things. Now, insurances, here's the thing. So US, Hurricane Ian had so much of loss, but it was insured. Pakistan, when I checked, Munich races, almost nothing was insured. So you see, that's the thing, that's the difference, okay? And then, so therefore, Global South, increasingly mission impossible. The pace of the change, the pace of the disasters, impact, and their capacity. Pace is, they're outpaced. They already were so weak, and they were slowly trying to build some capacity, but the pace of the change, the impacts is like so rapid that they are left, with nothing. And then climate finance, of course, that's the figure there, 4 trillion a year. That's what, I don't know if this is the figure I wanted to show you, but anyways, yeah, we can talk about figures. It's humongous, you see. And loss and damage, that we have secured loss and damage fund, that's just for namesake. The purse is still empty. We don't still know who pays, who receives. There's still tussle going on between developed and developing countries, primarily China and India on one side and the West to the other. And then attribution science. The challenge here is now, even if those countries, if they are to access the fund, they will have to prove that it was climate change. That's the attribution science. And that is going to be a massive challenge for those countries. Do they have the capacity? So look, I'm going to stop here. Maybe we can talk later on during Q&A, and then, yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, both of you for that really fascinating presentation. There are also some commonalities, but also quite different quirks. So as Navin, you mentioned that you come from a quite different background as a journalist. But I think one thing I found common in your sort of presentation is you're both interested in stories, like really, sort of more contextual stories. And just wondering, this is a question for both of you, how do you go about choosing your story? Okay, what to do research on, what context to focus on? Because I actually you focused on, you looked at Pakistan floods, Peru, Philippines. You've also written on Philippines and other places. Likewise, Navin, you've also focused on different parts of the world, collecting stories. So how do you go about choosing your stories, what to report? Do those stories come to you, or you have certain kind of ideas or framework or theories in mind that brings us to those stories? Or maybe so a little bit about your approach to picking and telling stories.
Sure. So I think I can just kind of speak to a very particular experience, which is mine, right? And I think that perhaps if someone else came from a different background, their experience with this would have been different. So I very much started by looking at the Pakistan floods, because actually the year that I started my PhD, 2010, I was going to write a PhD on water scarcity in Pakistan. And that year, Pakistan experienced what were then called the most devastating floods ever. So it seemed a little bit silly asking people about the problems they're facing with scarcity when they had just dealt with this really catastrophic flood. So I started working on flooding in Pakistan. And over the course of many years of doing the PhD, realized that Pakistan was the into exploring issues and topics that I really cared about. And I don't have better words to explain this than to say look at everything from a post-colonial angle. When you're a Pakistani woman in the Western Academy, you're expected to write on Pakistan. You're not expected to write on Colombia or Peru or whatever, right? So I had to first establish that I am capable enough to be able to work on other places, and then made my way to the Philippines, because some of the questions that I was asking in the Philippines were quite similar in Pakistan, because I was looking quite specifically at insurgency and disaster intersecting, which was what I'd been looking at in Pakistan. And that kind of intersection of insurgency and disaster led me to Colombia, because they were going through a peace accord in the midst of particular disasters as well. And that took me to Peru. So really it was a journey of being interested in a particular thing, but arriving at it through the framework that was available to me, which was Pakistan. Only if you work on Pakistan are you then going to be able to do the other things you're interested in doing.
I'm supposed to kind of report on the global South. So, and that kind of, you can imagine that encapsulates so many places. From Africa to, the other day I was talking about Solomon Islands, for example, what's happening to the leatherback turtles there because of climate change. Or let's say what's happening to the gorillas in Uganda. But the thing is, these days, it's interesting that, I, as a journalist, I use my instinct, and then I also go after issues. I really believe on issue-based journalism rather than event-based, because event-based journalism stories are normally filed from the ground. We have our colleagues, great network, but I'm always after issues. So like, what happened? What really happened? Why? The science of it, the politics of it, stories behind that kind of thing. But having said that, these days, it's interesting that these days, it's a bit become data led now. So our editors will before I pitch my stories, they will have seen what is kind of going on in the search engine. What are people looking for? What do they want to read? And that kind of thing. So I also need to do that, and then I go about it. So that, as a result, but I'm not passing any judgment here. It doesn't have to be my instinct all the time. Of course, audiences have the right; they can also decide. So yes, but my antenna, has to kind of also get that. So as a result, just today, we did a piece. That's been rolled out. The radio piece went out today. Text piece is going to go out next week. It's about this climate anxiety making women in global South decide not to have children. So this was something, quite Western thing until 2-3 years ago, or let's say 5 years ago. But there have been some recent research. We refer to latest one by the Nottingham University, and there are others also. But I managed to get some characters, real people, who explain to us. So that kind of story, my editors tell me that, wow, when people talk, then people read. But if you just talk about the university data, then people are not interested. So that's the kind of thing. That's the quest. Yeah.
Sure. That's fascinating. A bit specific to now question to maybe Ayesha. You also mentioned about, I know you work on like sort of everydayness of climate risk and disaster, and that's what you looked at in your book in Pakistan flood, the aftermath of the Pakistan flood. You also mentioned that in your presentation. I wonder if you could elaborate that a little bit, like how do you define everyday sort of everydayness? And you mentioned a little bit about how you try to interrogate and examine that, but a little bit about your definition of everyday disaster.
Yeah.
And sort of what you think about that.
Thank you. It's a really kind of critical and thought-provoking question. And I think, yes, everyone engages with ideas of everyday in different ways, particularly, I guess, you normally think of anthropologists using ideas of the everyday, and I try and use it in a more kind of spatial geography context. I think what I try and emphasize through use of something like everyday or lived experience or reality is that academic frameworks are not very good when studying disasters at recognizing how it's not just ever one disaster or one hazard that people are dealing with, right? In a really kind of strange way, the way that a drought affects somebody is that they are spending a particular holiday alone because there was no money, because that child couldn't get on that flight, because to come to the small village to. So the way that these things intersect with multiple other layers of socioeconomics, of citizenship, of, you know, that kind of intersection is very difficult to talk about in the absence of understanding that everyday life or that everyday context or that everyday reality. And so, for example, I was talking just a few minutes ago about my work on disasters and insurgency, or disasters and kind of insecurity. And what I've repeatedly found is that while a lot of our interest in the West is, you know, to understand, is South Sudan going to erupt into climate conflict? Is Syria now in the throes of a climate conflict? Is like these big geopolitical conflicts between states or between state and non-state groups around climate, around resources, etc. That's what everyone in the West is interested in. But on that day-to-day level, the people that I'm speaking to don't like care the slightest bit about this big geopolitical stuff that's making the news here, right? What they're saying is that the strong man in the local community is trying to kick us out using these particular hazard-related regulations. And he's saying, if you don't leave, I'm going to bring a government eviction order. You are too close to particular hazardous land. And so they are fighting, sometimes physically, and that's a conflict. And that's a very micro, but very real, very everyday conflict because of climate. But it's not in the way that we've constructed climate, but also that, in fact, climate and capitalism, looking at all of the oil and gas data that we've just seen, that we've just kindly seen in Navin's presentation, that climate and capitalism also are particular kinds of bedfellows, right? You can use the the climate agenda for so much, and it is very often being used to dispossess and to oppress marginalized groups. So I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying that those are the kinds of things that I try and unpack when I say the everyday of the disaster reality, or the everyday of the climate conflict.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's an excellent segue for the next question for Navin. I think from micro to sort of macro, because you've also done quite a bit of reporting on geopolitical sort of geopolitics going on, and particularly one thing that you reported, which you didn't feature in your presentation, but I know you've done quite a sort of long-standing reporting on geopolitics in the South Himalayan region, particularly between India and in China. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, like, just for our audience, why is it important to think like more, pay more attention to the Himalayan region, and particularly the geopolitics, particularly from the climate politics perspective? Why that region? Why it is important to think about it, and why pay closer attention to it?
Sorry. Okay, so the China-India thing. Just a quick context here. So last year, even now, if you are following news, then you might know about this trapped workers in this tunnel in North India. So it's the same region, right? So there are some places there, they are sinking rapidly. And so it was in the news that, why is this town sinking? What's happening? And then people are evacuated. It's a Hindu pilgrim site, high profile, and all that. So again, all the hard news were filed from the ground, and I was keen to explain the bigger story there. So the bigger story there is, you see, this is the place that is shared. It's a bordering area between India and China, the Himalayas. Okay, so and what happens is, this is the region, super sensitive in terms of all these changes, in terms of global warming. Now, this is where scientists should be focusing. They should be studying on the ground, transboundary, movements, studies, exchanges, and all that. But then, that this is where they are, the two countries, there's a standoff. And we've seen they've nearly they went to war just 2-3 years ago in Doklam, towards the eastern side, and now I'm talking about this is the western part. So China and India, basically what they're doing is to in this very, very intense confrontation and hostile situation, hostile environment, they are building rapidly, building infrastructure in this super sensitive region. If you look at Chinese side, I've referred, if you look at, well, Nimesh was talking about my story that I did, mentioning how many roads, tunnels, bridges, or airfields in all this super sensitive region. Same in India. So what happens is, they're not actually, it's the national security. Again, I'm not passing any comment here. They might have their own justification for both the sides. It's their national security. That's why they're doing it. They say that, and we report that. But the thing is, the fact also remains that because of the fragility of this region, so what happens is it already was dangerous. Now it's even more dangerous. It is more dangerous so many times, actually. And as a result, you see all this, so there's a kind of very strange thing, you see, so these are the two countries, engaged in this kind of hostile situation and rapidly building all that. And then all these years, all these INGOs, they kept on focusing on, very few things. And again, I kind of go back and look at, in introspection, and they kept on talking about few things. Just for example, that glaciers are retreating rapidly. So as a result, we won't have water in the future. And then our glacial lakes are rapidly filling up and they're becoming dangerous and they'll, explode, they will burst out and they'll sweep down everything downstream. That was the kind of narrative. And I, as a correspondent, was reporting that, just limiting to that. But then X many years down the line, after repeatedly reporting that, I had to think about, okay, what's going on here? So out of the tragedies we have seen now, so many people killed 2 years ago in Uttarakhand, in Indian side, there was this massive avalanche, massive thing. Actually, it kind of swept down 4 hydropower stations. 200 people died. So I kind of tried to investigate and check what's happening in the Himalayas, in the Andes, in the Alps, or in the Rockies, or elsewhere. But what I found was when glaciers retreat, it's not just about drinking water or water resources or glacial lakes filling up and becoming dangerous. It's actually what happens is when glaciers retreat, the entire geography of that place becomes so unstable that they unleash disaster. Sometimes the entire mountain flanks come down. That's what happened there. So that kind of thing. So when glaciers, they used to work, glaciers are like cement, keeping, those bricks intact. But when they disappear, all those, soil, rocks, boulders, entire mountain flanks, they kind of, they come out, they come down and kill. And that's what's happening. So that is, this is where the two countries should have been focused to study. But unfortunately, we don't see any joint studies or, rather they are, confronted. And then as a result, people, infrastructure, they are all facing this.
And smaller country like Nepal in the region have to face the brunt.
Yes.
Right?
Of course, yes.
So that's another tragedy. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. Now I think I've asked my share of questions. I have a few more, but I think we can stop there and just open up for question and answer. So question from the audience. Yeah, well, Mayor, we have yeah, so you can okay. Questions, right? Okay. Yeah, we can. Oh. Oh. I just realized that. Okay. Again.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you for both panelists and for your talks. I'm Omar Jazi. I'm also a lecturer here at HCRI. So my question is for Ayesha. I appreciate your desire to kind of place, material and epistemic coloniality side by side. But I wonder, isn't geography, post-colonial or otherwise, also essentially the engine of imperial knowledge production? And that's subsuming people's stories and their experiences, their knowledges, felt experiences, within the folds of disciplinary knowledge, also an act of violence. Just was wondering your thoughts on that. And also, when you say post-colonial geography, what do you really mean by that? Can you locate that a bit further for us? Thanks.
Shall we take another one? Maybe just a couple people. Yeah. And then is that okay?
Yes, yes, of course. Yeah.
My question is for Navin.
I think you're good. Yeah.
You want to be louder? That works.
Yeah.
Thank you. My question is for Navin, but before that, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to understand from a very broad perspective, the role of modern journalism. So, I mean, as you mentioned, there's a lot of journalism that happens on demand trends. And these days we are seeing shorter stories, faster consumption, everything is in sound bites and people want, Insta Reels, TikTok videos, everything's consumed very quickly. And if nuance is in such short supply and climate change communication requires nuance, not everything can be condensed into a soundbite for information to be so quickly consumed. So the question is basically, how should climate change communication evolve with these times when digital platforms are making it even more easy to consume information through very short, quick videos, but nuance requires time, attention, and detail. So how should journalism or climate change communication, scientific and non-scientific, evolve with those times?
Take one more and then.
Thank you for your talks. I have a question that goes in the same line. I'm pretty much interested in agenda setting and why governments debate and why do they prioritize certain topics over others. And I'm actually from the global south as well. I'm from Brazil. There's a lot of disasters going on right now because of El Niño phenomenon and like droughts in the Amazon, floods in the south of the country. And what shocks me when I read the news is that basically people say, well, this is natural disaster, as if natural meant common. So my question, I think for you both, is how can we tell different stories in a way that make governments really worry about the urgency about that? Ayesha talked about really fighting the terms of the debate. I don't know if that's related to that as well. And it's really interesting to hear the opinion of Navin as well about like how the press could do that as well in terms of reinforcing the urgency and the need to take immediate actions instead of normalizing, especially when events are getting more and more common. People say, well, that happens all the time. So how can we actually make them take action and tell stories? I don't know.
Ayesha, you want to go first?
Sure.
There's post-colonial geography. Yeah.
So really small question, right? Easy peasy. I think you you probably know that my answer to both of those questions is going to be I don't know, but that it is an endeavor worth pursuing, right? So maybe in some ways linked to both of your questions on the extent to which what I am trying to do by subsuming local narratives into bigger geographical frameworks is epistemic violence. I take your point, and I think that there are things that we need to be really mindful of and really careful of, right? But at the same time, to your second question on what do I really mean by post-colonial geography, I mean, at the end of the day, there's no taking away the fact that geography is fully complicit in empire, right? And the RGS still, in many ways, the Royal Geographical Society still represents that and still cancels Palestinian literature festivals. And it is a really difficult position to be in. But at the same time, I don't want to kind of say that hence there is no place for you and me in geography, right? And so I don't think that we represent the lone white man who was going off to discover new lands of native peoples and all of that. So I think there is a whole kind of body of work that I am building off of that is being that is using the work of subaltern studies collectives and post-colonial studies to chart a new way of thinking about post-colonial geography. I think it is too fixated. That's perhaps my critique. I think that whole body of work is too fixated on knowledge and just knowledge of the indigenous and knowledge production and knowledge, but almost a little bit too afraid to actually speak to the actual structures, the political economy, the material reality that creates those structures. And that's why I keep using the term the Western Academy, because we're so complicit in the production of those. But when you say that, you come up against real challenge, right? So I guess this leads to the question that you asked in a very roundabout way. All I see myself or my role in how can we get governments to take these things seriously is to just try again, right? What I do is not sexy work in government, even though I have worked for a brief period of time in the Houses of Parliament and things like that. What I do is very local, very ethnographic, very arts-based. That's not what government want to hear. Government normally respond to the big economic studies, the big climate models, the big, and I don't really work with big data, though occasionally I do. But perhaps an easy way in is that stuff, that their systems are all in place to listen to N studies that have looked across 200 sites and have come up with this. Government is normally very receptive to things like that, right? So that's where the disciplinary kind of knowledge hierarchies and power hierarchies come up. But once you have your foot in that door, then you can start to feed in the other stuff as well, which is how a lot of my work on working with policy starts. It starts with a colleague within the physical sciences or a colleague within economics being like, we really want you to say this, but can you come in through the back door? And if we're able to do that, then that's still better than doing nothing, I think, from my perspective.
Climate communication.
Yeah, so this is definitely becoming more and more challenging. And like you said, difficult topics, difficult issues. How are you going to say that? Can you believe? I just recently did a story on desertification. And then that was what, maybe 1,200 words or 1,500 words. And then somebody said, wow, it's so nice. Can you do a reel for us? I said, why not? And okay, so yeah, max 1 minute reel. And that story, I need to explain within 1 minute. So definitely it's very challenging. It's not easy, particularly when these are very, very complicated, multifaceted issues, a lot of things involved, investigative stories, which I do, for instance. But I think there's a way of doing it. The flip side of this is when you have varieties of these different formats, then the advantage is that you can use those different formats to lure in your audiences into others. What we need to be clear is that not all the audiences are going to like all the outputs. We have different segments. We have different kind of audiences. They are identified. When we do stories nowadays, we think in terms of gender, in terms of age group as well. So when we decide accordingly which age group, which gender, what all that, and then if the story warrants, if it's a very interesting story, then we do it multimedia. Yeah, and then, for example, if a story is put out in Instagram, let's say, quickly, so that story, that Instagram will have details and say that if you want more detail, go to our link, or somewhere else. If there is anything else put out, let's say, in any other outlet, TikTok, for instance, then we say that you could, if you are interested, go to this. You have details there, or even YouTube for that matter. YouTube, a lot of people go to YouTube nowadays, so that avenue is there. We treat it like that, but it is not possible for all the stories. We can't have time for all the stories. So yes, it is challenging. Well, that's how it goes. But I think if there are people who really want to understand the issue, then they will go for that option as well. They'll look for it, and so we cater to that. It is that kind of thing. Now, regarding government's thing, it is tricky. So I think my job is to make their life difficult. That is what I do, and that is how I draw their attention. So so for example, last year we did this story on, let's say, fake forests. So I exposed a lot of examples around the world where the governments they submitted big data to FAO, the UN's FAO, saying that we have this much of forest preserved, conserved, or restored. But I did an investigation, across the world in many places. So exposed Philippines, for example, their mangroves. They said they had so much of mangroves. We found that they were all fake. Almost 90% was fake. Similar story in Mozambique, for example, or India, for instance. In India, they kept on, in Uttar Pradesh, they held this, Guinness Book of World Record thrice, I think, when I did that story. But when we went to check where are those forests, there. So so that kind of thing. So the thing is, you have to keep on prodding and pointing, and then and again, when it comes to like, I'm not mindful. I am that each time the global South countries negotiate with the Western countries, the argument is that you have your historical responsibility. You have to pay. You have to do this. That's fine. That's okay. But then it is also very important that, those countries, those recipient countries, or let's say global South countries, even when we talk about climate justice, then we should be mindful about their own problems, their level of corruption, their level of, bad governance, and we need to bring those stories out as well. We just can't toe the line of these countries that they are kind of, putting those slogans out that West must pay, polluters must pay. That's fine. I'll report that. But I'll also check what your countries, what those governments are doing. Because if you are not taking care of your own people, in your own way, for example, air pollution, local air pollution, for example, then do I believe that you really care about CO2, atmosphere, methane, and all that? I mean, that kind of thing, you'll have to hit on that. That's my modus operandi. It's not successful all the time, but at times it is. I've seen that things change. Thanks.
More questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gloria. I'm a PhD student in planning and environmental management. and my research is about climate change adaptation in the global south. So I was very, very interested in both of your contributions. I have two questions, if I'm allowed.
Sure.
For whoever wants to pick them up. One of them has to do with something that I heard recently by an academic who was being interviewed on the topic of climate anxiety, actually. And he discussed the idea of unnatural disasters, which is something that people who study disasters know, right? Disasters are socially constructed. But the interesting bit is that this person was using it, talking about the flooding in Italy, in France, in Greece, by saying that it's unnatural because they didn't expect it. It isn't supposed to happen in these places. I think this has many readings that hopefully in the reception we can discuss. But I wanted to get your impressions on if this idea of it's unnatural because people, for example, in these cities that have better infrastructure or stronger governments, or I'm not sure what this academic was trying to talk about, but will this cause any change in how we understand risk and how we respond to risk globally? And the second is about the second question is about your experience in researching and discussing these topics about risk and disasters. What type of ethical considerations or reflections do you have when discussing topics that are so sensitive because they can cause great alarm, or when discussing sensitive topics with people who have been exposed, who have been maybe traumatized by this? I recently also saw another interview about the book launch, and the book was called "Heat Will Kill You First." And I was terrified by that idea of again thinking about climate anxiety and how people respond and approach. Is this I guess again ethical considerations and reflections? Thank you.
Maybe we'll take one more question. Yeah.
Thank you for this interesting roundtable discussion. In Navin's presentation, I saw the discrepancy between where we should be in terms of carbon emission and where we are currently. So clearly different countries are not meeting their commitments. And I guess it's partly because national leaders are hardwired to think of their national interests, whether that's economic or otherwise, and will always prioritize national interests over global commitments. So how can we maybe promote this mindset shift from being a national citizen towards being a more global citizen or global leader?
Yes, we can. On natural disaster, one on ethics is also another very, but I think coming from it, the way we academics think of ethics can be quite different from a journalism perspective. So I think that's a very interesting but quite big topic too, and of course about the economic versus national versus global.
So without meaning to kind of be dismissive of somebody's work, I'd definitely be interested in reading, their specific thesis or specific point on that they're trying to get across by finding it useful to use unnatural disaster as a framework or a way of framing this. The truth is that in the social sciences and humanities, we need to keep coming up with cleverer ways of saying things. Otherwise, why will anyone publish our paper, right? Like since 1970s, we've been saying, those who work in social sciences and the humanities, that disasters are not just because of the hazard, they're not natural. So now obviously we need to keep evolving the vocabulary, the language, to continue to keep producing new publications and new articles and new. So I don't know to what extent this idea of something being unnatural is different or requires me to think differently. I would obviously only be able to say that after kind of seeing what specific point they're making. On ethical dimensions, again, I would say that, I don't have a straight answer. I think that it is incumbent upon us to do the best that each of us can do. And when people, particularly because I work with people in a fairly intimate space, in their homes or in their community church or in the local school where we're having interviews, where we're talking, whatever, yes, when they talk about or they recall difficult moments of the disaster, sometimes it's very upsetting and people get really upset. What I can say is that in trying to come up with more decolonial methods, which give people a little bit more say, I don't think at all that this is a radical shift in the way that we do research, but in giving them a little bit more ability to frame the narrative, whether it is through the storytelling workshops, through the art, through decolonial methods, give a little bit more agency to the research participant, though I am fully aware that this is still a very unequal relationship, right? Like I am the foreign researcher there and they're the local person who experienced the disaster. From my lived experience, not theirs, I can say that having something like a workshop or speaking to people in that kind of community setting where, and many of our workshops are more women-led because the men are away and it's easier for the women to manage to commit a longer stretch of time. My lived experience or my kind of affective understanding of that space is that a women-led workshop where they're all talking about their experiences is a really positive celebratory space. It's very different to being in someone's home and having a one-to-one interview where you're asking them to talk about really difficult, painful things. And of course, even in the workshop where there are 10 women who brought their children with them, they're eating lunch, they're having coffee. It's a much more positive way to engage. Even then, of course, it's still upsetting. I cannot think of anyone talking about a disaster and not finding it upsetting, right? But maybe that's a good thing. Like it's a good thing that we're not so like desensitized to how horrible it is to live through a Category 7 hurricane or something. It is truly catastrophic, and for people to be able to express emotion that is equivalent to the catastrophe that they faced, perhaps there's something positive in that.
So, shall I go for that, or
on natural ethics, like journalism ethics, maybe a little bit on that.
Well, unnatural disasters, that's because in many countries they still say natural disasters, and I think that needs to be corrected now because that sends the wrong signal, wrong message. So, making it clear that but again, it is tricky at times because we cannot jump into, oh, that's climate change and that's man-made and that's anthropogenic, and it takes time. But then it is again like the way we try to at least is that refer to what scientific bodies have said, for example, what IPCC has said for that region, for example. Yeah. So the projection, or let's say the analysis of so many years has shown that this is what is happening or will happen in the future. And experts say that what's happened fits into that. That kind of thing, and rather than we saying that, well, that was climate change, and, and that's the attribution science, for example, that is what it's known as nowadays, and which is quite advanced in developed countries. For example, what Germany saw within a span of, 1 year, they brought out this paper saying that it was climate change. Now, developing countries, poor countries, do they have the capacity on attribution science? Not exactly, so you'll have to kind of deal with it quite carefully. And then, talking to all these victims, or let's say people affected, we have to think it's called duty of care. So you have to be careful, in terms of not upsetting and still and yet try to get the story. Because again, the idea here is that story is meant to not just, for the sake of getting a story. I think it's about, if there are issues, then those issues need to be addressed, and that's for a better, for positive changes. That's the quest, at least. That's why we are talking about that story. Why are we talking about that story? Why are we raising that issue? So that, there are issues there, people are affected, and that shouldn't have happened. But then perhaps, if that is rectified, if that's addressed, then it might not happen again. That kind of thing. So, we'll have to balance that thing there. Now, for the politicians thing, what they say, obviously, they say that, we've seen that everywhere in this country, for example. They talk about energy security all the time nowadays. That's what I'm saying. So imagine if Western countries talk about energy security, and therefore they say that we have to go back to, gas and oil, then what will China and India say? They're saying, wow, so till yesterday, you were lecturing us that we should get rid of our coal, and now you're going back to your gas and oil, and then you expect us, forget it. That was the give and take in G20, like I told you, I reported. Yeah. Now, I think, if you asked me as a journalist, my quest to get that story is that the real story? I mean, are politicians really, really concerned about cost of crisis? I'm not talking about any particular country here. That's something I would like to investigate. Whether the global south or developed countries, are they really, worried about people? And then they think that, people will suffer even more if we start, levying tax and all that, and then, raise fee tariffs for fossil fuels and all that. Is it people who will be suffering, or is it that there's some other nexus here? Is it that, the ruling parties, the powers that be, they have this nexus, the connection with corporate world, and the corporate world, or let's say fossil fuel industry. I'm just giving you, that's something I would like to investigate. I'm not saying, I'm not giving any, making any accusation here. It's a story for me to investigate, So are they in cahoots? And then people and the ruling class, people in power, they show those poor people and say, it's for them. I know there's climate change. I know we have to address that. But see, if I do that, then they will suffer. Is that the story? Or is that the backroom there, the corporate world? Don't want to move. That's what we saw. IES chief said, fossil fuel industry is investigating. It's just 1% of that whole investment that we are seeing now in clean energy. Is that the story? What's the story? I think that's something I need to, I think as audiences, maybe you also need to look for that kind of story or ask that question. I mean, again, I'm not being judgmental here, but I know, coming from reporting on the global south, many times I've seen authorities, they talk about people, they talk about their cause, but the real story is, just that they have got their interests somewhere else. They are kind of, and as a result, what happens is people suffer anyways. They suffer. So I think, that's the kind of story we would like to. I think. So yeah, so the economic gain, of course, it might be a genuine thing as well. But even that, even there, we are being told by experts that if you calculated the long-term economic costs, then the wise move is to correct it now. You might be just factoring in the immediate cost, but if you calculated what happens let's say 20 years, 25 years, we'll talk about future generations, you know, then this is the time. The longer you take, the costly it's gonna be. That analysis is also there. So yeah, thanks.
I think we have time for one round questions. Gareth and Joe.
Give that a go. Hi, Gareth Clay from the Department of Geography. I just want to pick up on that point about timescales. And you mentioned about kind of long-term planning, and I think in Ayesha's you were talking about the history of those events going back decades or centuries. So we've got kind of a need for long-term planning, but there's then a disconnect between the political cycle, which runs much faster on a year, sub-year basis in some cases. So how do we change the dial on that? How do we push politicians, power brokers to think about long-term planning? Is it about getting more people familiar with disaster planning and risk management and the people in this room who are studying at the moment? We need to get those people into those positions of power, or is it something else? So that question around timescales and disconnects between the political cycle and what we actually need.
We have one here. Joe.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just stand up.
Yeah.
Sorry to just arrive, but I was watching on Zoom before. So, and thank you. And so I'm running a project which is looking at climate and social system tipping points, meaning when do things suddenly tip, you know, and change very drastically. And obviously, if you have a flood in Pakistan, then yeah, everything has tipped in a physical sense. And the question is then, okay, so what else tips in a social or economic or political sense? The example that we keep coming back to is Syria, the Syrian civil war. Was climate change a material factor in the causes leading up to the Syrian civil war? And a famous, well, a well-known paper came out saying, yes, we think it is. And then a kind of critical paper came to follow that, saying, no, there's really no evidence to say this. Maybe there's no evidence. And so this, for me, puts the finger on a much bigger problem, which is that climate change and disasters are not, you know, isolated things that happen. You know, they are deeply embedded and entangled in everything else that is going on, particularly, you know, politics and economics and conflict and power struggles. So without going into the whys and wherefores of the Syrian thing, which you could run a meeting on, you know, next time, but to say we have a problem of attribution and understanding how this stuff works when everything is deeply entangled in everything else. And if you can throw any light on that, I'd be so grateful. Yeah.
Great. Time scales and attribution.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been leading for a long time, so.
No, I spoke quite Indian just now. So maybe you should go ahead. Yes. No, I'll supplement.
Yeah.
So I think in many ways, you know, your question on temporality, again, it's not a particularly small one. Right? This is really the big challenge, right? I think the only thing that I can kind of keep pointing towards or keep highlighting from very much my positionality is that there is this real epistemic power imbalance where, just like in response to the question we were asked on what sets government's agendas, the thing is that the climatologists and the meteorologists and anyone with a gist at the end, the geologists, the natural sciences can still show those mathematical models or whatever climate models to government and get them to enact something that will prevent something in the course of the next few months or years or whatever, right? But again, what we are talking about from the perspective of the humanities or the social sciences is that, can you please go back to 300 years of history and see all of the ways in which these colonial structures are now really contributing in very material and also non-material but more social ways to the disaster. That's so much harder to do, firstly. And secondly, who's got the ear of the government? Like who's going to say, doing this post-colonial or decolonial thing is really, I'm going to champion this, and I'm going to be the minister for decolonizing or something. There just isn't that political constituency that exists either. And then thirdly, perhaps this is the slightly more depressing thing. What we keep seeing in places like the Caribbean or in Puerto Rico, for example, is that there is really no will to, right? There is no will. When you talk about the margins of where imperial structures work, and all my work is really in the margins. I don't work in the big capital cities. There is no political will. Like, who cares about those people in those corners of the so I think that kind of mixture of factors make it particularly challenging. The sciences, the lack of political will, and no real person within government leading on these things. How we can address this? I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but
Anything?
Well, this is, I mean, I think it's pretty much academic thing, and I'm so afraid now, you see, because it's an uncharted territory for me. But having said that, again, because I've been reporting this for many years now, and I'm left with this question that, okay, so how long? For example, I've been reporting on COPs, God knows how many COPs, and this is COP 28, so 28 COPs now. So I think that's why I'm now seeing debates like degrowth. So I think, to me, I'm tempted now to take this thing to my audience. That, okay, and I'm still trying to follow and read and talk to people and digest myself and see, because the thing is, every time we talk about it, okay, there is COP, there are projections, there are findings, there are figures, and then, things it's the same or it's getting worse. We know that. Now, I think, so what are the fundamentals? What needs to be addressed? What went wrong then? What is not being addressed? What is the basic? I think those things are pretty much important, rather than just, relying on, because at the end of the day, what happens is, like I said, like I told you, the example of glaciers. So all these years, I was told that glaciers would disappear. And two things I was told by many scientists, and that's what I reported, that, glaciers would disappear and there'll be no drinking water and no irrigation or no hydropower. And then, glacial lakes will fill up and they will sweep us away. But events showed that it was not just that. It was more than that, way more than that, because when they disappear, the entire geography gets destabilized. They are the ones, actually. Glacial lakes, if you compare, now if you look at all these events, what's happening in the Himalayan region or elsewhere, it's the landslides, it's those avalanches that come down, and then block the rivers, and the rivers themselves then burst out, that kind of thing. So they are more dangerous. So that is the kind of, it evolves, and you are forced to think that, okay, what are those? Do we need to question the fundamentals here? And that's why degrowth is something I'm trying to, maybe next stop is, I should think about this story. But again, my challenge is I cannot talk about degrowth just like that to my audience. You see, my editor will be the one to kick me out first. It needs to be very much simplified, and then, I need to tell the audience, but these are very, 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 very important topics. And I just can't tell the same story all the time. The root cause, the basic thing has to be addressed. So yeah, so I take your point that, it's not just being symptomatic, so it's a quest, it's an effort. Thanks.
We almost run out of time, but I just want to ask one final question.
I think we did have a Syria civil war.
Oh, geez, sorry. Sorry.
I've been trying to think of how best to respond to that. Because it's so challenging to speak from a disciplinary agnostic position, right? Like, so much of that debate a particular debate on whether the Syrian civil conflict was in fact climate-led or not it depended on who you asked. Obviously, those who worked in politics, who were looking at particular end data and the weather forecast and matching it up through particular ways, they said it is a consequence of the drought. And those who were kind of more embedded in the social realities on the ground said, no, actually enough rural people didn't move to the urban centers to start the discord and all of that, right? So it really was like, in some ways, a war of politics versus anthropology, geography, or something like that. So I think the big question is really, even taking aside or removing climate from this discussion for a moment, the age-old conversation here is, how do you make broader interdisciplinary conversations possible, right? I mean, I am really tired of, I think Navin mentioned the world weather attribution. I did some work with world weather attribution on attributing the Pakistan floods to climate change, anthropogenic climate change or not. And I was repeatedly being hit with the same sort of, but this is your opinion, this is your perspective. Social science is always kind of dismissed to, but this is your opinion. Yes, it is your opinion based on years of research and a particular lens and and until that opinion, which is absolutely not, it is as scientific as science, until that is not seen as equal to what the meteorologists and the climatologists are producing, we just can't take that debate further, right? The debate keeps getting stuck on that point of, but what you are doing is not scientific and what we're doing is scientific. And I think that, yeah, that's the kind of first block roadblock we have to cross to get to a point where actually what we're contributing is being considered valid and equal and all of those other things.
No, I think.
Okay. I have one final question. I think we've already done, but as a critical disaster researcher and climate change, we also see disaster as, like a window of opportunity, all this thing like climate risk. So I want to, especially our students, to leave with a message of hope and possibility, like because we talk a lot about uncertainty, complexity, inaction, and things like that. What would you tell to the student, like in terms of like maybe if they want to choose a career in climate change as a researcher or as a climate change reporting, what would be your message to the students?
Okay, this is a slightly kind of hackneyed and overused example because I use it a lot, but it's hard to have positive messages from catastrophic situations, right? So I only have one, yeah, and the main kind of point I made, and some of it I feel has not proven to be true, but at the point that I made it, it was 100% true, is that in my research, and perhaps you've already taught some of your students this, Nimesh, if you talk about my book. In my book, I argue that there was something quite specific that emerged in Pakistan in the aftermath of the 2010 and 2011 floods, catastrophic floods, millions of people affected, a fifth of the landmass underwater, entire kind of towns destroyed, etc., right? And then in that moment, what the state did was that they instituted a citizens' compensation damage scheme, which meant that every single citizen who was domiciled in an area affected by the flood was entitled to a cash transfer based entirely because they're a citizen, because they have a citizenship number. And this was partly possible, again, really sinister, because everyone in Pakistan had to get a citizenship number post 9/11, geopolitical imperatives, America saying, we want every single citizen on the record. So something that sinister led to something like a Watan card, which means the country card, or a Pakistan card being issued, which was an ATM card issued to every single citizen, who could then take that ATM card to an ATM machine. Of course, huge practical hurdles. People had to stand for days in those queues. There aren't enough ATMs. But eventually, every single person, very few exceptions, got access to the money that they were supposed to get. So what I came across a lot when I was in the field was that discursively, the state had not said getting cash transfer after disaster is your right. This was in no way a citizenship right. But discursively, when they were talking about it, they were repeatedly using the language of rights and of what they are owed and what the state owes them. So really quite accidentally, if you look at the National Disaster Management Act in Pakistan, instituted in 2010, the state has nowhere said that providing disaster relief in the form of cash transfer is our duty and it is your right. It's not. It's very much by favor that the state gives you anything. But the way that it was instituted quite accidentally resulted in a disaster citizenship to emerge amongst millions of people. And what I argue is that once that kind of organically emerges, it's really difficult to roll it back, though the state tried, and that's a less positive story. But the point is that sometimes quite kind of accidentally, you do end up transforming citizenship. And actually, I do use the phrase of tipping points. And this was quite a critical tipping point in state-citizen relations that came about very much because of a disaster scenario.
Final word, Navin.
Well,
Words of hope.
Look, I mean, the thing is, again, I said, each time we do a story, why do we do stories? I mean, of course, these days, the clickbaits, tractions, and, that's there. But I still am guided by this notion that I'm raising an issue for a cause, that, that something has to be brought out. And then that will need to be addressed and things will change for betterment. That's the line, basically. I think it is for that, we look for, because somebody will have to do that. Those issues will have to be brought out, particularly when, the whole world is talking about this crisis. Then, there will be lots of stories there, lots of stories. But I think just a tangent in this is what I say nowadays is you don't have to be full-time journalist to write or to report all this. I think your expertise as when you study or you go out to the field and come back with that knowledge, like what we learned from Ayesha today, what she showed about those communities on the ground. I think, you could write something. I mean, you might call it citizen journalism or whatever. But given that we have so many forums nowadays, I think that information also helps in the wider scheme of things. Because when you discuss those issues, when you bring those things out, then I think authorities, they will at least they will see. I mean, I'm not saying that it might lead to a drastic change overnight, but that atmosphere, that tempo, gradually, it helps. It helps if you are kind of really, really looking into it. If you are, for example, if you are from a particular country, and if you are following what that country has submitted, the nationally determined contribution, NDC, as it is known in the UN lingo, what climate plan they submit. If you are following that, and then you're trying to see, does it actually, does it show the reality? Is it actually, or is it guided by somebody else? The templates, as we know nowadays, all this INGOs, they have their templates and they kind of give it out to those countries and they just fill those templates and submit. So does that reflect what people want? That kind of thing, you know? So I think it helps. It helps when, particularly when from knowledgeable people like you, when it goes out, then I think sometimes it's better than even doing us, because people might ask, okay, what does Navin know? What is his qualification? I might be dismissed. He's just a journalist, a mere journalist. But when you guys, when you have your credentials, your university degree, and you are experts on that, when you are saying that, I think that weight carries. It has the impact. I think it works. So yeah, so this is not just to I'm not. I've seen it and it works. And believe me, when I see those kind of tweets, I follow those people because they are my sources. So thanks, thank you.
Okay, so I think we can end on that positive note. Thanks again to our fantastic speakers, Andrew, Miriam, everyone behind the scene for organizing this. Again, as I said, we have a reception that follows right after this, non-alcoholic drink if you want to come. And thanks for being here. Thank you.